My daughter-in-law showed up at my front door at 11:30 at night, holding a set of keys she'd had copied without my knowledge, telling my neighbor she was there to start moving things out because the house was being transferred to her name. My neighbor called me. I was 4 hours away visiting my brother in Phoenix. I listened to what she said, and I smiled in the dark of his guest bedroom. I told my neighbor, "Let her look around. She's about to find out something very interesting. I want you to follow my story all the way to the end. And while you're watching, drop the city you're listening from in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches." I'm 64 years old. I worked 37 years as a civil engineer. I built bridges, literally. I supervised projects in 6 states. I raised one son, Thomas, mostly on my own after his mother Carol passed from a stroke when Thomas was 19. I am not a man who panics. I am a man who plans. My name is Robert, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of how my daughter-in-law spent 18 months trying to take everything I had built, and how I spent those same 18 months making sure she never could. Her name is Diane. She married Thomas 4 years ago. I want to be fair when I describe her because fair is important to me. She is intelligent. She is organized. She has a way of presenting herself that makes you feel like she's the most reasonable person in the room. For about 6 months, I genuinely liked her. She remembered how I took my coffee. She asked questions about my work. She laughed at the right moments. Thomas was happy in a way I hadn't seen since his mother died, and that mattered to me more than anything else. The first crack appeared about 8 months after the wedding. Small, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. I had come over for Sunday dinner, something we did regularly, and Diane mentioned almost in passing that she'd been looking into financial advisors. Not for herself, for me. She said she'd heard about a firm that specialized in helping people who were getting close to retirement age manage their assets more efficiently. She said it with such warmth that it took me a full minute to realize she had just described me as someone whose finances needed managing. I was 62 at the time. I was still working. My retirement savings were healthy. I had no debt. I owned my house free and clear. I said I appreciated the thought and changed the subject, but I didn't forget it. The second crack came 2 months later when Thomas called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual because we usually talked on weekends. He said Diane had been doing some research, and they were both a little worried about me living alone in such a large house. It was too much upkeep, he said. The yard alone was almost a 1/4 acre. Had I thought about downsizing? I asked him when he had started worrying about my yard. He said he'd always been worried. He said Diane had helped him realize some things he'd been pushing down for years, including the fact that his father was getting older and wasn't going to be able to manage things forever. I was 62 years old, running 4 miles 3 times a week, and maintaining an A1C that my doctor called impressive. But according to Diane's research, I was a problem waiting to happen. I told Thomas I'd think about it. I did not tell him that I immediately began paying very close attention to everything Diane said and did around me. Over the next several months, a pattern emerged. Every concern she raised about me was vague enough to seem caring, but specific enough to do damage. She mentioned to my neighbor Helen that she'd noticed I sometimes left the garage door open overnight, which was true exactly once after I came home late from a work trip and was exhausted. She told Thomas's cousin at a family gathering that I'd called Thomas by the wrong name twice in one phone call, which never happened. She mentioned to my doctor's receptionist, who she knew socially, that she'd been concerned about some behavioral changes in her father-in-law. I know about these conversations because Helen told me directly. The cousin mentioned it awkwardly at Christmas, and my doctor brought it up at my annual physical with a careful expression that told me someone had been planting seeds. I want you to understand something about this kind of manipulation. It doesn't come with a villain's announcement. It comes with a soft voice and concerned eyes and the language of love. It comes wrapped in phrases like, "We just want what's best for you, and nobody's saying you can't manage. We just want to be sure." By the time most people realize what's happening, the story has already been written about them. Friends and family have already been primed to see them as fragile. The narrative is already in place. I had spent 4 decades solving engineering problems. The core principle of my entire career was this: identify the failure point before it fails. I was not going to let Diane write my story. I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia Holloway who had handled my estate planning since Carol died. I told her what had been happening. I told her I suspected something more organized was coming and I needed to be prepared. Patricia had been practicing elder law for 23 years. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "Robert, you're right to be concerned. What you're describing has a name. It's called undue influence, and it's the setup stage. She told me we needed to act before anything was put in motion, not after. We spent 3 hours that afternoon restructuring my assets. My house, which I had owned outright for 11 years and which had appreciated to just over $420,000 in the current market, was transferred into a revocable living trust. The trust was managed by Patricia's firm. It could not be touched by any power of attorney document, forged or legitimate, without a process that would take months and require court oversight. My investment accounts were updated with new beneficiary designations and additional protections. My will was rewritten with conditions I will describe later. I also hired an investigator. His name was Dale Mercer, a retired sheriff's deputy who now ran a small private investigation firm out of Tucson. Patricia recommended him. I told him I needed to understand exactly what Diane was doing and who she was talking to. What Dale found over the following 6 weeks changed everything I thought I understood about the situation. Diane had met with 2 attorneys in the past 3 months. Neither of them was Patricia. The first meeting was with a general practice attorney she'd found online. According to Dale's sources, she'd asked questions about conservatorship proceedings in Arizona, specifically what evidence of cognitive decline was needed to initiate the process and how long it typically took. The attorney had given her general information and apparently recommended she consult a specialist. The second meeting was with a specialist, a man named Gerald Holt, who operated out of a strip mall office and who had, according to the state bar's public records, received 2 formal complaints in the past 5 years for representing clients in elder guardianship cases that later came under scrutiny. Dale got me copies of those complaints. One involved a case where an elderly woman's assets had been liquidated within 4 months of a conservatorship being granted. The other involved accusations that Holt had helped a family member misrepresent medical testimony. I read those documents sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. My house was quiet. Outside, the desert evening was turning pink at the edges, the kind of sky Carol had always stopped whatever she was doing to watch. I thought about Thomas, my son, the child I had raised alone for 15 years after his mother died. The young man I had driven to college in my pickup truck, helped move into 3 different apartments. I watched walk across a stage to receive his engineering degree, while I cried in the 3rd row trying to look like I wasn't crying. He was standing in the middle of something he might not fully understand, being pointed like a compass by a woman who had studied him carefully enough to know exactly which direction to point him. The most painful part was not knowing how much he knew, whether he was a willing participant or a managed one. I decided to find out. I invited Thomas to lunch alone. No, Diane. I told him I needed help with something at the house, a repair that required an extra set of hands, because I knew he wouldn't come otherwise. He'd been avoiding one-on-one time with me for months. When I told him it was the water heater, he agreed immediately. He'd always been the kind of son who showed up when something was broken. He arrived on a Saturday morning looking tired in a way that was new. Not physical tiredness, something deeper. We worked on the water heater for an hour, and then I made sandwiches and we sat at the kitchen table, and I asked him the same question I'd asked Thomas once before when he was 16, and I suspected he'd been drinking at a party and lying to me about it. I said, "Tom, talk to me straight. What's actually going on?" He looked at me the way he had at 16, caught somewhere between relief and panic. He said Diane had been worried. He said she'd been pointing out things he'd been too close to see. He said she thought I was showing early signs of isolation, of resistance to help, of what she called rigidity of thinking that could be a precursor to cognitive issues. He said she had printed out articles. He said she had a folder. I asked him if he believed it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he didn't know what to believe anymore. He said Diane was very convincing. He said she had a way of presenting information that made it hard to argue with. He said he'd started to see me differently. Not because he wanted to, but because she kept offering him a different picture until the original one started to seem like the one that was wrong. That was the most honest thing my son had said to me in over a year, and it broke something open in my chest in the best possible way. Because it told me that Thomas hadn't gone anywhere. He was still in there. He'd just been handed a pair of glasses that changed what he saw, and he hadn't yet figured out that the glasses were the problem, not his eyes. I told him I loved him. I told him I wasn't angry. I told him I needed him to trust me for a little while longer without asking me to explain everything, and that when the time came, I would show him what had actually been happening. He looked at me for a long moment, the way he used to look at me when he was trying to figure out whether I knew something he didn't. Then he nodded. I recorded that conversation. Thomas knew I was recording it. I asked his permission first. He said yes. Over the following 2 months, I continued to let Diane believe her plan was progressing. I allowed myself to seem mildly confused on the phone when she called. I mentioned to Thomas that I'd been having trouble sleeping, which was true, though the reason was that I was spending late evenings going through documents with Patricia rather than anything related to cognitive decline. I accepted 2 pamphlets Diane gave me about independent senior living communities in the Scottsdale area without commenting on the fact that both of them prominently featured buyout packages that would require liquidating my home. I watched her, and I documented everything. Dale confirmed that Gerald Holt had prepared paperwork. He had sources inside the legal community and would not tell me how he knew, but he was certain. The documents were a petition for limited conservatorship, the kind that would give a designated family member, in this case, Diane through Thomas, authority over financial and property decisions for an individual deemed unable to manage those decisions independently. The petition referenced observations about my behavior, dates, incidents, some partially based in reality, twisted, some invented entirely. They were planning to file. I spent a weekend in Phoenix with my brother Frank. This was partly because I genuinely wanted to see him, and partly because I had arranged, with Patricia's help, for something to happen while I was gone. Patricia had contacted Gerald Holt's office through a third party, letting it be known that a client had come into her office with concerns about documents Holt had recently prepared. She did not specify. She did not threaten. She simply made sure that the information would reach Holt that someone knew something. It was meant to make him nervous, to make him reach out to Diane, to push them to act sooner than they had planned, before they were fully ready. It worked faster than I expected. My neighbor called me on a Thursday evening. It was 11:20 at night. He said a woman matching Diane's description had arrived at my house with a key, had spoken briefly with him when he came out to check his mail, and had told him she was beginning the process of assessing the property because the home was being transferred into her and Thomas's care. She had a folder under her arm and a confidence that my neighbor described as like she already owned it. I thanked him. I asked him to document what he saw and not to interfere. Then I sat in Frank's guest room in the dark and made 2 phone calls. The first was to Patricia. The second was to Detective Anita Ramos of the Maricopa County Elder Fraud Unit, a woman I had met 3 weeks earlier when Patricia introduced us, and who had been following the case with professional interest since I first described what was happening. I told them both, "It's time." I drove home the next morning, 4 hours, straight through, stopping once for gas. I arrived at my house at 7:15. Everything looked exactly as it should from the outside, which meant she'd been careful. But I knew my home. The small blue ceramic bowl on the entryway table had been moved 2 inches to the right. The hall closet door, which I always kept at a specific angle because the hinge was slightly loose, was closed completely. She had been through the house methodically. Thomas and Diane arrived that evening. Thomas was quiet in a way that worried me. Diane was performing concern with the polish of someone who had been rehearsing. She hugged me at the door, both hands on my shoulders, eyes searching my face with an expression she had clearly decided looked like love. We sat in the living room. Carol's reading lamp was on in the corner, casting the warm light it had cast for 20 years. I had put it on deliberately. A small reminder, to myself, of who this house belonged to and who it was full of. Diane opened her folder. She said she and Thomas had been doing a great deal of research. She said they had spoken to a professional who had helped them understand that sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who have the hardest time seeing when they need support. She said they had consulted with a legal professional who had explained the options available to families in situations like theirs. She said it with the voice of someone announcing good news. She slid a document across the coffee table toward me. I did not pick it up. I looked at my son instead. Thomas was staring at the carpet. His jaw was tight in a way I recognized from his childhood, from the moments when he knew something was wrong, but hadn't yet figured out how to say it. I said, "Tom, look at me." He looked up. I said, "Do you know what's in that document?" He said he did. He said it was just a precaution. He said the attorney had explained it was for my protection. He said the word protection the way someone says a word they've been taught rather than a word they chose. I said, "Has Diane told you about her 2 meetings with Gerald Holt?" Diane's composure shifted, almost imperceptibly, but I had been watching her face for 18 months, and I saw it. I said, "Has she told you about the conservatorship petition Holt prepared? Or about the complaints filed against him by 2 previous clients?" I said, "Has she mentioned that one of those clients lost her home within 4 months of a conservatorship being granted?" Thomas turned to look at his wife. Diane said I was confused. She said this was exactly the kind of thing she had been worried about, this tendency to take fragments of information and construct a paranoid narrative. She said it gently, with practiced sadness. She said maybe we should call someone. I said, "You're welcome to call anyone you'd like, Diane. But first I'd like to play something for you." I picked up my phone and opened the recording application. What played through the speaker was a conversation from 3 weeks earlier. Dale's work. Diane, on the phone, speaking to a woman whose voice I did not recognize. The conversation was not subtle. Diane was explaining, in clear and specific language, that the goal was to get the conservatorship in place before the old man figured out what was happening and had time to respond. She said if they moved fast enough, the property would be theirs to manage within 60 days. She said Thomas was handling it fine. He just needed to be pointed in the right direction. Thomas went absolutely still. The silence in the room lasted a long time. Then Thomas said, in a voice I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager and genuinely frightened, "Diane, who were you talking to?" She said it was out of context. She said he didn't understand. She said everything she had done was for him, for their future, because his father refused to accept help and someone had to be practical. Thomas stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to us for a moment, looking out at Carol's rose bushes in the yard, the ones I still pruned every spring because it was something she had loved. Then he turned around and said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The doorbell rang. Patricia Holloway came in first, carrying her briefcase. Detective Ramos came in behind her, and with her was a uniformed officer I hadn't met before. Diane looked at the detective's badge and said nothing. Patricia set her briefcase on the coffee table and removed a set of documents that she placed beside the ones Diane had brought. She explained to Thomas, with the precise and patient language of someone who had done this many times, exactly what Gerald Holt had prepared, exactly what the petition claimed, and exactly why none of it could succeed. She explained the trust structure. She explained that every claim in the petition about my cognitive decline had been directly contradicted by documented evidence she had compiled over the past 3 months, including 2 independent neurological assessments I had undergone and a letter from my physician. She also explained that attempting to file a fraudulent conservatorship petition, particularly one built on fabricated observations and the involvement of an attorney with a history of ethics violations, constituted elder abuse under Arizona law. Detective Ramos stepped forward. She said, "Mrs. Diane Whitfield, I have some questions for you. You have the right to have an attorney present." Diane looked at Thomas. Whatever she was hoping to see in his face, she didn't find it. He said, "I'm not going to help you right now." She was escorted out. The officer waited with her in the driveway, while Ramos took an initial statement from me. Holt had already been contacted by the county bar. He had, as Patricia predicted, chosen to cooperate fully in exchange for leniency. The documentation he provided confirmed what we already knew, but made it significantly easier to prove. After everyone left, Thomas and I sat at the kitchen table. I made coffee, the same way I had made it every morning for 30 years, and I set a cup in front of my son, and I sat down across from him, and we stayed there for a long time without saying much. He asked me when I had known. I told him about the Sunday dinner with the financial advisor suggestion. I told him about the conversation with Helen and the doctor's receptionist and Thomas's cousin at Christmas. I told him about the afternoon with Patricia, about Dale, about the weeks of documentation. He said, "You were doing all of that while I was out there believing you needed help." I said yes. He put his face in his hands. He stayed like that for a moment. When he looked up, his eyes were red. He said, "She kept showing me things. Articles. Notes she said she'd made. I thought she was worried about you. I thought I was missing something obvious because I was too close to it." I said, "She's very good at what she does, Tom." He asked me what happened now. I told him Diane would be facing a criminal referral from the county and likely charges related to elder financial abuse and conspiracy to file a fraudulent legal petition. Gerald Holt was already in the process of losing his license. Thomas would need to decide what he wanted to do about his marriage, and I told him clearly that whatever he decided, I would not make that choice for him. He asked about the house. He asked about the will. I told him the trust protected the house from everything that had been planned. I told him the will remained what it had always been. Everything to Thomas, in full, without condition. Because regardless of what had happened, my son had not come to my door with a copied key at midnight. My son had been handed a false story and had believed it, the way a person believes a map before they discover it's been drawn wrong. That's different. He stayed that night. He slept in his old room, the one with the window that faced the backyard where I used to throw him pop flies on summer evenings. I could hear him moving around up there the way I used to hear him as a teenager, the particular creak of the floorboard near the closet, And I sat downstairs in Carol's chair, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not triumph. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter. The particular peace of a man sitting in his own house, in his own chair, in his own life, which is entirely his. 5 months passed. The charges against Diane moved through the system at the pace the legal system moves, which is slow and methodical and serious. She retained her own attorney, a better one than Holt, and there would be proceedings ahead that I would be asked to participate in. I was prepared for that. Gerald Holt surrendered his license in lieu of disbarment proceedings. Patricia sent me a copy of the final order with a handwritten note that said simply, "One fewer. Thomas filed for divorce." He did not make that decision quickly. He did not make it dramatically. He made it the way my son has always made hard decisions, slowly and privately, and then absolutely. He called me on a Sunday morning in November, which is when we usually talked, and he told me he'd spoken to an attorney and he was moving forward. He said he wasn't angry anymore. He said he was mostly just sad. He said he'd spent 4 years being shaped by someone else's hands without realizing it was happening, and that the hardest part wasn't discovering that Diane had tried to take advantage of me. The hardest part was discovering how far he'd moved away from himself without noticing. I knew that feeling. I had watched my son drift in a direction that wasn't his, and had spent 18 months unable to do anything except protect what I could protect and wait for the tide to turn. I told him I was proud of him. He told me to stop being sappy. We made plans for Thanksgiving. I still run 4 miles 3 times a week. My garden is in better shape than it has been in years because I've had more mental space to attend to it since I stopped using that space to monitor a threat. There's a bed of dahlias along the south fence that Carol always wanted to plant but never got around to, and I put them in last spring, and they came up spectacular. Thomas comes over on Sundays now, the way he used to before Diane. He brings pastries from a bakery near his apartment, and we sit on the back porch, and we talk about nothing important, which is the best kind of talking. Sometimes we don't talk at all. We just sit in the morning sun with our coffee while the desert warms up around us, and I watch my son learning to be himself again, one Sunday at a time. A few weeks ago, he asked me if I ever felt guilty about the plan, about letting things play out the way I did, recording conversations, letting Diane believe she was winning while I was working against her. I thought about it honestly. I told him that guilt requires believing you had a better option. I didn't. I could have confronted Diane early with incomplete information and watched it get dismissed as paranoia. I could have involved law enforcement before I had evidence and watched the case collapse. I could have told Thomas everything before he was ready to hear it and pushed him further into her orbit. Every one of those choices would have left me exactly where she wanted me. Engineering taught me that the strongest structure isn't the one that never bends. It's the one that's been designed to carry the load. You don't build a bridge by hoping the weight won't come. You build it by knowing the weight is coming and making sure you've accounted for every pound. I built a bridge. It held. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom would have liked that explanation. I think she would have too." I went inside and refilled our coffees and came back out to the porch where my son was sitting in the morning light that was starting to come through the oak tree in long, easy angles. And I handed him his cup and sat down and looked out at Carol's dahlias and thought that this, right here, was what 70% of my life had been spent building toward. Not the asset protection, not the legal strategy, not the victory over a woman who had underestimated what 64 years of living and working and loving and losing can do to a man's instincts. This, the porch, the coffee, the sun, everything else was just engineering. The most dangerous thing someone can do to you isn't take your money. It's convince the people who love you to stop trusting their own memories of who you are. Robert didn't win by being louder or angrier. He won by staying grounded in what he knew was true, building quietly, and leaving the door open for his son to find his way back. That Sunday porch, that coffee, that silence, that's what he was protecting all along. A friendly note. This story was crafted and imagined by AI, shared to entertain you and, hopefully, leave something worth carrying with you today.